Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into the studio for more on casting and preparing your work for being exhibited to the world. This video will be a touch shorter than the usual videos simply because there isn't too much to talk about today. But we'll cover mounting your sculpture and painting the sculpture in this video. So, at the end of this video, we are going to have a sculpture that's display ready. First order of business when attempting to do this process is figuring out how to attach the sculpture to the base. While we have plans to use a wooden base, it doesn't really matter what kind of base you are going to use. No matter which material you choose, you need a way for your sculpture to attach to the base, of course. We are going to be using L brackets. They might have some different names, depending on where you are from, but I've heard them referred to as L brackets, so that's what we're going to use. Essentially, it's an L-shaped piece of metal that has holes in it. The biggest issue we face is how to attach said L bracket inside our sculpture so that it's parallel to our base. If the base and the bracket is not parallel, then we will end up with a gap between the bottom of the sculpture and the base, of course. This is not a good thing. In order to properly do this, you'll notice that I would need the bottom of my sculpture to be completely flat before beginning this process. However, at the moment, this is not the case, and this is where I'm failing right now. In retrospect, it would probably be better to make sure the base is flush with the bottom of the sculpture before attaching the bracket. Later in the video, however, I do ensure the bottom of the sculpture is flush with the base, so you'll see how I accomplished that, but it should have been done before mounting the bracket. In order to have a decent chance at mounting the bracket flush, I've come up with this strange contraption. I'm using pieces of wood, 2x4s, to prop up my brackets. There's certainly a lot that is not going to be exact as perhaps a machinist would want it with this technique, but for my purposes, for our purposes let's say, it is going to be enough. The brackets are then mounted to another piece of 2x4 using a C-clamp. This little rig can be removed with the L bracket still attached to the wood, so that I can get easy access inside the bottom of the sculpture for as long as I need to, before placing the L bracket. This method really worked about as well as I needed it to, with the exception mentioned above that the bottom of my sculpture is not really as flat as I would have liked it to be, and therefore I do run into some issues with one of my brackets later on, and it has to be removed. Now you can get away with using one bracket, but if you use one bracket, the sculpture can still rotate around that one bracket, so it's not ideal. Ideally, you should have two brackets. I mark the inside of the sculpture with a permanent marker so I know exactly where I want my L brackets to line up once I get to attaching them, once I have put resin on the inside of the sculpture and once I'm ready to attach the L brackets. Attaching the L brackets is a very straightforward process that if you've been following my tutorials for a while here, should come as no surprise. Since the sculpture was cast using a product called Hydro-Resin, I used the same material to attach the L brackets. Hydro-Resin sticks very well to itself and is really strong, so it's the appropriate material to choose for this application in my opinion. If you want to know more about Hydro-Resin, you should check out some earlier videos in this series, where I cover a lot more specifics on the material, its mixing ratios, its working time, the hazards associated with working with composite casting resins like this. Everything is covered in, I believe, the first video in this series. The resin is mixed up and brushed on inside the sculpture first before the bracket rig is placed. I have more space to work this way, and I can get resin where I need to, without having the bracket in the way. Or the rig, rather, in the way. The rig and the bracket, actually. It's important to not only cover the area where the brackets are going to be placed, but also a wide section around these areas. You'll see why soon. I then place the rig with the brackets inside into pre-planned locations and cover the metal brackets with resin as well. Then I'll place pre-cut fiberglass over the brackets and into the Hydro-Resin. This is where making sure the surrounding area is covered with resin becomes so important. Because I want the fiberglass to properly attach to the inside of the sculpture, and the fiberglass will have a much easier time doing that and laying down flatly and evenly on a wet resin surface as opposed to a dry one. I pre-wet the surface with resin, in other words. The first pieces of fiber I lay down are also dry pieces. They are not dunked in resin, because when the surface is wet with resin and the fiber is dry, the fiber kind of lays down and sticks to the surface a bit, sucks into the surface a bit. If the resin is of the right consistency, this works really well. Now if it's too thick, this won't occur because the resin will be too dry for the fiber to stick, and if the resin is too thin, it's too liquid to hold on to the fiber and the fiberglass will not stick to the surface. The L brackets will experience some force trying to hold the sculpture and the base together, of course, or at least there is the potential for said force to be applied to this connection. So to make sure the bracket is really secure, I use 3 layers of fiberglass to hold it in place. And hopefully, this will make it really strong and will keep it from going anywhere. Now if I've done this correctly, the C-clamps should not be attached to the brackets, and the wood should come off as well. You do want to be a little careful when applying the resin because it is really strong. So if you attach something you didn't intend to attach to something you didn't intend, you could be in a lot of trouble. You can work carefully to accomplish the task, or you could also release areas where you don't want resin to stick with a release agent. And for this material I would probably choose Vaseline as my release agent.